Welcome to IterateUX. The people who all are new to IterateUX community, welcome. And the people who all are there in the community attending other events, welcome back to our weekly events. Okay, first I'll quickly introduce about myself. I always forget that. So myself, Padma. I'm the co-founder of IterateUX community. Okay, so today we have a event on research workshop wherein we are having design challenge, 4 weeks of challenge in different phases like research, define, ideate, prototype, and test. So today we have Jennifer Fast with us and she will be taking the research workshop for us. She is one of the amazing mentor that we have in our IterateUX community. So thank you, Jennifer, for having us over here. Okay, moving ahead, quick introduction about IterateUX. So we are a community wherein we have all the experience levels of people in the community, and we provide the platform to learn, connect, and grow with each other. So we arrange weekly events like on Thursday, every Thursday we have weekly events. Then we arrange coffee chat session on our Discord platform. We arrange monthly whiteboard challenges as well wherein people can come, join, and participate and sharpen their interview skills and collaboration skills as well. Then we do have a portfolio and resume review on our Discord platform, wherein we have a ticketing system on our Discord platform. Feel free to utilize that and get help from our mentors and senior designers. We do arrange design challenges if you are aware of that. Like now we are having a UXT challenge in this particular month from August to September. We arrange different type of challenges as well. In last month we were having UX writing and UI challenges. We were having UI design challenges as well. So we provide practicing for our users wherein all the UXers and designer can practice as much as they can. We can provide some feedback reviews from our side, from our mentors, and then people can excel on their skills as well. So these are the things that we provide for our UXers. Moving ahead, okay, so these are our next upcoming events. Today we have a research workshop. Next week we will have our define workshop, which is on 25th August. Then we will have on September 1st, we will have ideate and prototype workshop. And then on 8th of September, we'll have a usability workshop. So for all these 4 workshops, we have for this particular design challenge event, wherein the participant can get help from our mentors, learn something from our workshop, and then they can work on that particular phase, which will help them to work on some project, a good UX project, and make a case study and showcase that in their portfolio, which will help them to get a job in UX industry. Okay, so these are the thing. And also after these event, we will have some presentation event as well, wherein participant can share their presentation and our seniors and mentors can critique and give their feedback and reviews as well. So that also we do have. Then before we begin, please unmute yourself when you need to share something. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the session, end of this event. Feel free to ask questions in the chat box, chat window, wherein we can take all the questions out there, or else unmute yourself at the end of the session and ask questions. Yep. Engage in our Discord with different channels, start conversation, and be kind and have fun. Moving ahead, okay. If you really like what we are doing for UXers, feel free to donate $1 also. That will help our community to run this community, wherein we have many other areas as well. And we are here as a non-profit organization, wherein we are providing all the services in free, and we are making our UXers life better. So yeah, feel free to donate. We have shared one support us link also. Feel free to donate. Moving ahead, okay. So before we start, I'll just mention few more things. We have shared few more links in the chat window, wherein if you would like to volunteer with us, we have shared that link as well. We have shared mentors volunteering link as well. Feel free to share that. You don't need to become an expert or very senior level. You can anytime join us as a volunteer, And if you know any other good mentors where you can recommend them, feel free to share this link with them as well. Yep, so we are good. And now I will hand over it to Jen.
Well, welcome everybody to phase one, which is going to be our research workshop, where we're going to look at defining a research plan. So I'll start off kind of discussing what discovery research is and isn't, and what is the point of doing discovery research, and some common pitfalls that people tend to fall into when doing discovery research. And after that, I'll take you through different phases or different steps in creating your own research plan. So you have some jumping point off of knowing kind of like what is going to be your first research project, getting an idea of how you can better define what that research project will look like as you head into this discovery phase. So given that, since it is kind of a little bit of a working workshop, I do have, if you can get a paper and a pen or a pencil, or even if you just want to use a notebook or a notepad on your computer, anything works as well. You can also always just watch this in hindsight and kind of go through the steps again. So feel free to do that as well. I'll just zoom through all this part. So about me, I'm a staff UX researcher at ServiceNow. I specialize in qualitative research, though I do mixed method, and I've been doing research for the last 9 years. I really love cats. I have too many of them, lots of plants, and I also do figure skating. Looking at that agenda, as I mentioned, we'll start kind of with an introduction to what is discovery research and what isn't it. And then we'll go through 4 different steps, where first we'll look at defining and focus what we know about our current users, and also what do we need to know about our potential users to kind of define where do we maybe say we don't need so much research, or we can do some background desk research, and where do we actually need to be engaging participants, and how do we focus on those particular questions. After that, we'll look at participant strategy. So who are going to be your potential users? How do you define who those users are, and how can you go about recruiting them, given that a lot of what you're going to be looking at is not through user testing like a lot of big corporations typically use, but you're going to have to get creative in your participant recruitment. After that, we'll look at picking a methodology. So we're going over 4 different methodologies here that are typical in discovery research phases. We won't go deep into them. I'll let you kind of do your own research around that, and I'll also provide some resources later on as well. But feel free to ask questions and engage me on Discord if you have any questions about getting a little bit deeper into particular methodologies, but we will go over them at a high level. And then the last step is when you go into creating your actual research guide, what are some best practices and tips for creation of the actual research questions? A lot of times the questions end up too general, don't quite get to the point, or aren't on topic. And so we're going to look at best practice tips to avoid all of that. And then at the end, as Padma mentioned, we do have a Q&A. This may go over time in warning. Hopefully I'll stay mostly on time, but feel free to list your questions. Feel free to reach out to me on Discord, add me on Calendly, put a meeting on there. Anything, I'm free and welcome to help. So in this introduction, I first wanted to kind of look at the different phases that are involved in the first place. And so you're very much aware of the different phases that we have in this challenge. And so I kind of wanted to show you what that looks like in an end-to-end process and where we are currently. And so, for example, here I use the triple diamond method, which is what I use personally in my work as well. So this kind of shows in the beginning, you might have an initial brief, you might have an initial sort of idea or feel of what you might want to go after, but you're really looking at exploring opportunities in this discovery phase. You're learning about your user and uncovering opportunity and needs to make sure that you're building the right thing for the right person, and that you're not going to end up with a mismatch or with a product that actually doesn't reach actual user needs. So we're very much in this very beginning stage on the left-hand side here. And then as we kind of move on, once we have all of these ideas, all of this information, then it's a question of how do we actually focus on specific ones to come up to an actual identified problem set that we want to go after. And so that's that next step where we'll have that workshop hosted by mentor Ashley, who's going to look at how do we actually identify the problem statements that you're going to go after. Once we go through all of that, it kind of goes back out to divergence once again. So now that you have these problem statements, it's a question of what different ideas do you have floating around? Let's list out every idea we can think of that could reach some of the problem statements, not with knowledge of the users that we gained in this discovery phase. And so that reaches the ideation phase, which is the workshop hosted by mentor Halik. And then at the end, you'll come back to me again, where we're looking at, okay, now we have these ideas for our product. Let's create some designs And then let's see what designs are going to be best fit and why they're best fit. Or let's make some choices based off of research and based off of valid data to then determine which is the best option to choose and go forward with. So just to give you an introduction to the different phases here. So now that that's done, moving into what is discovery research. So discovery research is really a very large umbrella term, which is where I had trouble making this workshop because it's very broad, but it's a lot of research that can be done in the discovery phase, which is before any design has been started, any solution has been set. You should be coming to this with a very blank slate. So this is really crucial to setting projects off in the right direction, because then you're going to be focusing on the right problems and therefore building the right thing with the knowledge equipped from talking to your users. So discovery research, first of all, helps to understand the problem space. So the research helps the team to empathize with potential users through gaining intimate knowledge of current problems that they face, how they're solving for those problems, or in some cases just aren't, and also understanding common pain points that they share in the space. It's also defining the problem scope. So learning about our users' foundational needs will help to determine what we should and shouldn't have as a priority in our actual solution, helping us create some barriers and create a focus. It's also gathering evidence. So it's building a solution right out of the gate that typically doesn't end well. Typically, there's a lot of issues with that. Doing this pre-discovery research will really help provide evidence on user needs and solidify our problem statement and surface opportunities to bring back an idea on as a team to ensure that what we build is going to be usable and is going to be reaching user needs. And also finally, gaining clarity and direction. So alignment at a very early stage is really key to project success. If you have misalignment from the get-go, that's really going to snowball and become much worse as you go on in team projects. And so therefore, doing this discovery research helps level set everybody on what do we know about the user, what do we need to know about them, and what do we need to find. And once you find that, figuring out how to best create a solution that meets all of those different needs that you then uncovered, and how to get deeper into some of the opportunity spaces you uncovered as well. So why should we do it? There's a lot of argument in UX research. We always fight for doing this discovery research, but oftentimes it gets passed on because it does take a lot of time. However, this often ends up taking a lot more time if you don't do it. So four different reasons why you really want to make sure you do discovery research. First is to gain user understanding. So empathizing directly with users and truly knowing the problem space enables user understanding, which without that, you take many risks of building a product that is assumptive of user needs. Even if you have hypotheses, even if you have stories from friends and family, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's representative of an entire user base. And so actually talking to many different users from different demographics and different sets of behaviors will help you fully understand the users as it comes to the topic that you've chosen. Also, finding opportunities allows us to create a product that truly sells for user needs and sets itself apart from the competition. So by talking to them, you may find areas where they say, I don't really have any solution that meets this particular need. That's a space that you can directly play in that would help gain users from competition that actually aren't solving for those needs because they perhaps haven't talked to those users. Also, again, the alignment. So that misalignment really has a snowball effect that causes bigger and bigger problems as phases progress. And doing a proper discovery phase allows everyone to align on who the user is, what their needs are, what problem you're trying to solve, and what they consider to be a success. So all of this works to minimize risk, avoid doing unnecessary work, and also steer clear of miscommunications at an early stage. Especially when you start involving larger teams and different departments in work, this becomes very key. So as far as what it isn't, and this is where things often go wrong. So there's often a conflation between discovery research and hypothesis validation. So it's common that you have so many ideas, you're so hyped up about this topic and this problem space that you can think of so many different ways to approach it. However, what you want to do is kind of put all of those on the back burner and say, we need evidence to support which direction could be even viable to begin with. Some of your ideas may not actually reach any kind of actual user need that exists out there today, or maybe a very small niche need from users rather than a general need. And so what we want to do is avoid having all of these assumptions based on personal experience. So it's not evaluative. We're not looking to determine what is and isn't a good solution off the bat. That is really what happens in the end phase, or testing phase. We're really looking to uncover opportunity spaces and understand our users. It's also not assuming. So everyone should carefully consider what is knowledge and what is an assumption. Knowledge will actually be rooted in evidence. So things like secondary research, there's scholarly articles, there's previous research study results, there's market surveys you can rely on. That is all actual knowledge that's rooted in evidence. But assumptions may seem like knowledge, so you should always consider if what you're saying and thinking is based on concrete evidence or it's just based on conjecture. It's also not prescriptive. So discovery is just that, because we are discovering user needs, goals, tasks, etc. We're not coming to the table with readily made ideas or solutions. And it's also not siloed. So a key pro of doing discovery research is to get the entire team aligned on the problem statement and actively engaged in understanding all of our user needs, the goals, and the success factors before anything has ever been committed. So make sure that as you take this back to your teams, you all share your thoughts about this workshop, what you came up with as we go through the different steps, and come to a consensus and alignment on what is the best path forward. So now that we've kind of gone over what discovery research is in general terms, we'll dive a little bit deeper and get started on creating our first research brief. Our first step is defining in focus. So we're going to brainstorm around two specific areas. First, what do we already know about our users? So this can be things we can either safely assume, where there's kind of a low risk if we are wrong, or things that we can actually find evidence in secondary research, which is, again, research through scholarly articles, others research available on the web, things like that. And then secondly, what do we not know about our user? So these can be things that we either have no knowledge of, or things that we may need to dig deeper on to fully understand the context to uncover opportunities. And marrying these two areas together will help our team to align on what we already know and what we may need to dig deeper into, which will help define what our scope is going to be for our research project. So this is where your pen and paper come in handy, or whatever you may be using. At the top, what I want you to do is create an area for what you already know. And this is also where having a topic comes in handy as well. If you haven't chosen a topic already, think about maybe one or two topics that you're most interested in, and then base this activity based off of that. So at the top of your paper, create an area for what you already know. And here I want you to list out everything that you already know about your potential user and the problem space that you chose for your project. So for example, if your topic is number 2, accessibility for touchscreens, you may have like a family member with disability, like a visual impairment disability or something like that. You may have heard them complain that they pressed the wrong buttons on the ticket machine and it gave them a ticket for the wrong time. And in that case, here you could list that a common user problem for accessibility could be touch screens having accurate entry and knowledge of where to press for what they want when given multiple options. It could be an issue for people who have visual impairments. And so while this would likely need a little bit of deeper research into understanding the full context of the situation, it's a good starting point to better help define what specific problem you may want to focus on. The most ineffective research projects are research projects that are so broad that they don't actually include any reusable insights in the end. So we're really going to work on narrowing some of that scope. Also, you want to include an area below that to list what you may not know, but what you feel like you could find evidence of. And this is where it helps, because getting access to participants is, one, very costly on time and money. And it's also not the easiest thing to do in our current situation. So given that, we're going to want to rely on a lot of secondary research and desk research that we can do on our own. So for example, if you chose topic 1, you can safely assume that there is a large amount of data available through scholarly articles or online that points to various disadvantages that minority groups face when it comes to obtaining quality mental care. And so you can rely on some of that research to then provide some context or opportunity areas that you may want to look deeper into, and you can list that here. As another example, for topic number 3 and number 4, like learning platforms and redesigning STEAM, there are many solutions out there already that you could look at yourself and do a competitive analysis or heuristic walkthrough to identify areas of friction, pain points, and opportunities to improve, to have some point of to jump off of. It's a little bit harder when you're creating a net new product, but when there's competitor products already out there, you can always fall back on some of these less active participant engaged methodologies to get some research and some evidence. So these are not really substitutes for in-depth research with real users, but they are great ways to gather some information and uncover some opportunities on a short timeline, because they could be done alone or as a group without having to go through the full research process of having to find the right participants, having to contact them, schedule them, all of that. So keep this in mind as you go into your projects. Given that we only have a week to do all of our research, that's a really short timeline by my standards. And so you definitely want to utilize all of these different methodologies where possible. So next, and don't worry if I'm going too fast where you haven't listed everything out yet, just keep going. We just want to start writing down some of our ideas to come back together as a group. Once you're back together as a group, you'll have everyone to utilize off of. And so you'll have way more ideas, way more points of interest to talk about there. So next, what we want to look at is what we don't know. So on your paper, create an area for what you need to know. Here, I want you to begin listing out everything that would be helpful to know about your potential user, as well as the problem space that you've chosen for your project. So as you're listing these different unknowns, make sure that they're important to defining your problem, empathizing with your user, or defining what success would look like. This will help keep the topics really focused to create a research plan that is concise and not too broad. So I've listed some at the top here, some example considerations to help. So avoid being overly specific at the same time. We do want to still stay at a broad, high level to make sure we kind of remain open to opportunities. If we get too specific, we do run the risk of pigeonholing ourselves into a solution that may not actually accurately solve for the full extent and context of users' problems. So I've also listed some methodologies to consider here. Those we will actually go into more detail later. So you don't have to really worry about those at this time, but I did want to kind of list that out. So here we're looking at things like, do we need to know our users' goals? Do we have any idea of what that might be? Do we have any evidence of what their goals would be as they look to do whatever your topic is? There's also key tasks and activities. So what are the kind of key things that they look to do within that topic space? For something like Steam, you could focus on storefront. And so in that case, one of the key tasks would be searching for a game that I'm interested in or purchasing that game. There's also tools and solutions, which is obviously like I use Steam in this example, or I may use Coursera for learning. Also, how they define improvement and success. This is very important because this will help you also later on define what is your metric for how your product eventually solves further problems as well. So this may look something like someone saying, I define success when I'm able to find a good deal on Steam, feel like it's a great price and easily check out with it and instantly start playing it. There's also pain points and needs, which is your more typical considerations. Pain points, we're looking less at a solution-specific view of pain points, but a more broad level. So things like when it comes to mental health services, I don't even know where to start. That can be a broad level pain point without getting into solutions and tools. Also on the needs side too, we want to stay a little bit broader. So we want to state our needs as broad level things such as, I need to have access to my mental health care services and it needs to be good quality, because otherwise I may suffer dire consequences that puts me in the hospital with bills that I cannot afford, which would then cause a snowball effect on my mental health. So I'll give you a little bit of time there. Hopefully we do make it in time. So now that you kind of have this triangulation of what you do know for sure, what you think you might know, but could probably get evidence of through other means, and then also what you don't know and need to actually talk to participants about, what we want to do is create a problem statement. And so this is always included in all of my different research protocols. Every project I starts with, what is this project about? And also give background information. So in this case, for example, what the project is about, you could always say something like, I'm doing this to put a piece into my portfolio. This is through IterateUX. We had these topics. I chose to do number 3, for example. And when it comes to background information, in this case, it's always helpful to include any kind of story that relates to why you chose your topic. So going back to that accessibility issue, you could say, having that family member and watching them struggle to do basic everyday things that every person should be able to do on their own really like caused empathy in me and really made me want to go out and create a world that is more inclusive. And that is where this project comes in. So also we want to look at defining our research scope here. And make sure to keep all of this pretty brief. Don't make it super lengthy. We want to make this as concise as possible. So when it comes to defining your research scope, you will want to include who your user is, or if you have multiple users, who your different users are. And that could be something like people who are low income, people of different ethnicities, people who are STEAM users but are unsatisfied with their storefront, for example. You also want to include what your topic scope is. So for example, looking for mental health services. And you also want to include what you will gain from this research. So whether that's something like understanding their journey, looking at their needs, really exploring their activities, or empathizing with their struggles. And so taking all of these different parts, who your user is, what the topic scope is, and what you will gain from this research will help you better define what your research scope will be to make sure that your scope is not so broad that it looks at too many different users, your results are way too scattered, and you have nothing clear to go off of. And so I have an example research scope here. We hope to map out the journey that low-income people go through as they look for mental health services. We will learn about their needs, activities, and struggles through this process. So this looks at something like journey mapping to understand what is that journey and see all of their different emotional states, their needs, activities as they go through every single step of their process. Also, we want to look at defining success. And don't think of this as designing success for the project, so much as designing success for this research specific phase. And so things like, what would you have learned? What would you have hoped to achieve? What artifacts would you create? And what workshops would you facilitate? So for example, success can include things like common key activities between both low and high income STEAM store users. You hope to learn a little bit more about that. Or you might hope to achieve opportunity spaces where there's gaps in mental health resources for disadvantaged people, or even just alignment within the team on a particular direction to take. Let's say your team has 5 different directions that everybody wants to take their own direction. Well, let's have alignment as a key definition of success as we learn about our user here. On the artifact side, that's things like creating a journey map and even just like creating a list of what our personas might look like. It doesn't have to be a full-fledged persona, but even just having some of those artifacts attribute to your success can help define, okay, what is going to be that next step? We've talked to the participants, what next? And also on the workshop side. So you can even include success in facilitating workshops. So you could say, our next step is to do affinity diagramming based off of all the insights that we found in our research. Or we want to do storyboarding given the steps that we found in our journey mapping project. So on step 2, this is looking at participant strategy. So now that we've set up kind of what we know, what we don't know, and created our scope and defined success for this phase, the next step is really to look at better defining who we ideally want to talk to and also how we can go about finding them. And so recruitment can look a lot of different ways. And as you come to very specific solutions, tools, and topics, this can change quite a bit. But in general, I focus on 3 different areas, which is demographics, behaviors, and experience. And so here I kind of want to note that it's necessary, I want you to note what is necessary to have and what is kind of just a good data point to potentially collect. So for example, if I'm focused on accessibility, I need to make sure my user uses aids like screen readers. But on the other hand, it may just be applicable to know how long they have been using screen readers, as someone who has used screen readers all their life may have a very different experience than someone who has just started using them a week ago. So do note what might be an interesting thing to track versus what is something that is necessary to have. And so let's start by writing down some important demographics to track. So here it's really easy to just list out every demographic you can ever think of, but consider what demographic may cause a difference in your insights. So for example, if your topic's on STEAM and you're looking at redesigning the storefront, education may not really cause a large difference in the participants' answers and the insights you get. However, on the other hand, income level is likely to affect their behaviors and how they shop because it's directly tied to shopping. In that case, in analyzing your data, you'll be able to create hypotheses on how demographics may have affected differences in goals, key tasks, needs, etc. So you can say, we found that people at a lower income level actually had a different way of shopping that was very much based around coupons and deals and getting things at the right time versus people who had high income levels. They were looking to basically grab anything at the time that they wanted it as it was new and at its highest price point. So this is something that is good to keep in mind as you go through your recruitment. So next, we will also look at listing some key behaviors we want to track. So the idea here is basically the same as the demographics. We need to consider what behaviors are likely to cause deviations in our data. We also need to consider what key behaviors we definitely want our participants to have. So for example, if you chose topic number 1, health and wellness, you definitely want to make sure that your participants are interested in mental health resources. Otherwise, they may not be a target user for your solution. So again, going back to what is necessary to have and what is going to be something that you're screening people out by, and what are things that you just want to ask just for knowledge of to later do in your analysis and consider as you look at their information and their insights versus what their demographics in recruitment are. And in the last section, we'll look at experience. And so these will be things like tools that they use, for example, in this case, Steam, engagement level, or time spent on a platform. So it's not just what do I use, but how often do I engage with it? So this can look something like, for example, if I'm looking at redesigning Steam, someone who spends barely an hour a week may have a different experience than someone who's on Steam constantly and all the time and very invested in the platform. So you may want to look at tracking things like how long they have used Steam, how long they've been on the platform, how many hours a week do they spend on Steam, or how many hours do they spend specifically on a storefront, for example. You can make this as specific or as general as needed. So here I'll just quickly flash up an example. And this is very much tailored towards an online recruitment screener. It will be more informal and more flexible when you're actually recruiting in person. But having your recruitment criteria clearly defined in this way will help make sure that you don't waste anyone's time speaking to the wrong people, both yours and your potential participants as well. And so here you can see that I've separated out the different demographics, behaviors, and experience categories. I've also included particular questions, and they'll either say pass or screen out. So pass basically means, yes, they're still within our target audience. Let's keep going along to the next question. Screen out basically means actually you're not quite the target audience we're looking for this topic. So let's, pass on actually going through the full process of interviewing you. You'll also see that some say some say track on it. So number 3 says track for what is your ethnicity. That's because we don't necessarily want to say we're only looking at Asians and Indians, for example, but actually we just want to track it because that could then influence what kind of accessibility they have to like mental health resources, for example. And so here you can see the screener is very obviously arranged where we're looking at like a younger representative of people. We may be interested in specifically like Gen Z and millennial mental health and their access. We're also looking at specifically lower household income levels. So people who are less likely to have access to the full gamut of mental health resources and quality resources at that too. And so here's just a quick example to see how you can structure some of your recruitment criteria so it's easily understandable and easily something you can align on between all of your teammates as well. So when it comes to approaches to actually getting participants, this is looking specifically at low-cost approaches. There's much more easy approaches as you involve money, of course, as you go through bigger platforms such as user testing. But here's some low-cost approaches that each have their own cons. So please consider them carefully and recognize the risks that they pose to your insight gathering. So each of them have some cons that may introduce things like bias that you'll have to consider as you're going through your analysis. And there's a part of doing the analysis that is basically screening through your data and making sure that the data integrity is there, making sure that it is sound data and not something that could possibly be based off of conjecture or something that's false. And so at the top left, first we have guerrilla testing. So that involves intercepting people, typically in high traffic places like a coffee shop, and asking them to sit down with you for a small amount of time. This requires a lot of courage on the part of the interviewer, which is why I try to avoid it. And is also generally better utilized in evaluative methods where you can actually show concepts to people to keep them engaged. Right now, we're really looking at engaging people in discussion and learning more about them as a user rather than showing them concepts, showing them designs. And so this method gets a little bit hard because of that. It's also hard to control specific recruitment criteria because you're just asking a stranger. And you don't want to be asking them to disclose really personal information. You don't want to be approaching someone and saying, hey, do you happen to be within this and this age? Or do you happen to be this particular household income? It's not something you want to do in that setting. And so this makes recruitment a little bit wider and harder to control. There's also stricter time limits on this approach because no one wants their coffee time interrupted for 30 minutes by a stranger. So you're likely going to have to keep the topics very concise and do a lot of different I won't say testing, but you're going to have to talk to a lot of different people and ask parts of different questions to try and triangulate all of your data through this method. Next, you also have the very common friends and family method. And this is a good option for many because disclosing sensitive information, like a lot of these topics have like mental health and accessibility issues, disclosing that sensitive information becomes less of a problem because you know them already. And you can always ask friends of friends to further connections for help. So you don't have to stay within your own specific sphere of friends and family, but you can go out to their friends and family as well. They're also more likely to be willing to spend more time with you, which is great for foundational research and discovery research, because typically all of the methods take a fair amount of time to be really useful. You're looking at 30 to 60 minutes. However, some of the biggest drawbacks of this approach is bias. So you will have to be very careful in your questions and also your analysis to try to reduce the amount of bias that you have in the insights that ultimately determine what your solution is going to be and what it looks like. Then we also have social interest groups. So these are things like subreddits or LinkedIn groups, Facebook groups, for example, that are focused on user research. You can also advertise for participants through special interest channels. So for example, our accessibility or our STEAM, you could see if anyone would be willing to talk to you about their experience. And so here, when you're advertising to these social interest groups, you definitely want to make sure that you're including a purpose and you're letting them know what is kind of the expectation. Oh, we want to talk to you for 15 minutes. It's going to be over Zoom. You also want them to know, I'm doing this as part of a challenge because I'm hoping to include it inside of a project and get me a job eventually within UX research or within UX design, whatever that may be. You want to give them some purpose as to why they're doing this. Also, finally, there's just general online resources. You can more or less find anything on the internet these days, and that's especially applicable to things like day in the life of type videos. And so the limiter here is that they may not be necessarily accurate to real life, and you won't be able to ask follow-up questions, but you could see things like if they would be willing to chat with you or even answer comments that you leave. So you can look up videos such as someone with vision impairment trying to use an ATM. And you can watch these videos and do a kind of observation through these videos to gather some information, and that's going to cost you basically nothing. And then you can try to engage with the poster and say, hey, do you know this person? Could I maybe talk to them? I'm doing this research project, and go from there. It's also worth noting here that there are some trial versions of online testing platforms that kind of offer like speak to 3 users for free, get started and talk to 1 user for free, whatever that may be. And those may be good avenues to utilize as well. Also, most recently, as I was creating this workshop, I found Polywork, which seems to be, at least from what I see, a really good option here, where people who are from very wide varying jobs and interests come together and say, yes, I'm available for user testing. I'm interested in helping out with these projects. So that's definitely an avenue that you may want to look at as well. And that's Polywork. So in step 3, we're going to be looking at picking a methodology and figuring out what method could fit best. So we're going to be covering 4 typical discovery research methodologies here, so you can kind of understand what the typical application strengths and weaknesses are to each of them. And this will kind of help you decide which methodology may best fit your research scope and timeline, given what you already know and what you're looking to find out. So 4 different methods here. There's contextual inquiry, semi-structured interviews, diary studies, and journey mapping. So on contextual inquiry, This is ethnographic in nature, which means that basically you're going to be going to someone's environment that they naturally do things in, and you're going to be observing and interviewing the participant there. And they're basically going to be conducting activities the way they normally would. And so, for example, think of going to a participant's home to watch how they regularly browse the Steam store and then interviewing them for more details on what you observed. So you're able to see the full 360. You can see their environment. You can see that, oh, he tends to have 10 energy drinks next to him because he's browsing this store for hours on end, looking at every game possible. You're able to collect all of these details that you wouldn't normally be able to collect in other methods. Next, we also have semi-structured interviews, which probably everyone is familiar with at this point. So semi-structured interviews are conducted using a small set of pre-scripted questions to help guide the overall conversation. Small set particularly because you're not looking to ask every single thing under the sun. Rather, you're leaving time and room for flexibility for deep dives into particular areas of interest that you uncover as you speak to the participant. And this also allows for a high level of flexibility within the research topic. As you uncover something new, a new opportunity perhaps, you can say, tell me more about that. And you can dive a little bit deeper into it without having to queue up a whole new interview and a whole new question set that goes along with it. After that, we have diary studies. And so this is interesting where you actually have participants log their thoughts, experiences, and activities over a period of time as they engage with the relevant product, service, activity, whatever it may be related to your topic. So for example, you could have participants create a diary entry every time they access their learning tool to understand what causes them to access it. What are their activities over the course of their session, or even just what are the various experiences they may run into and how do they perceive and use each of them. And so finally, there's journey mapping. So journey mapping, kind of like contextual inquiry, consists of observation and interviews, but it has a slightly different context. The goal is also slightly different as well. Journey mapping focuses on every touch point the participant has with the solution and notes what are their goals, their activities, thoughts, and the experience at every single touch point. So you can see kind of perhaps as I go through booking my airline ticket. In the beginning, my experience may be great. I'm excited about this vacation that I'm going to take. Everything looks good. We're going to have a great time. But then as I start actually booking, as I start getting options, you may see my experience drop and you may see my emotional state get frustrated because I'm not able to find the option that I want. All these times are different and it's not what I want, even though there's so many. That can easily cause a drop and a potential opportunity area for you to then go deeper into in the interview. So then we're going to go a little bit deeper into each of these four. So first, starting with contextual inquiry. So this is really a powerful method for obtaining in-depth and accurate data from a participant. The idea here is basically to have the participant lead the session in their natural environment. So for example, if I normally do my banking while I'm waiting for my morning coffee at Starbucks, for this research project, you would then go with the participant to Starbucks and have them go through their normal activities as if it were really any other day. So this being an in-context method gives the most natural feeling for the participant and has them do tasks in the moment versus having to recall things as is typical in interviews. And so therefore, it's also more accurate and reliable. Contextual inquiry is a great fit for the discovery phase, as you may uncover many insights that you never would have even thought to ask questions about through more structured methods such as semi-structured interviews. So there's a lot of things to uncover here that you may have just never even thought to consider. Contextual inquiry is usually performed with one participant at a time and in the environment where they usually perform their tasks. So rather than recruiting one participant to perform every task under the sun, especially if you have quite a few, the tasks can also be split up among different participants to observe and understand all the tasks in depth and make sure that you're not giving so much to one participant that they tire out and they get frustrated with the experience that they're having in the research session itself. So make sure that you consider how much you're asking of the participant and know that there's flexibility in splitting it up. That being said, there are also some disadvantages to this method. You'll find this a lot. A lot of these qualitative methods are time consuming. That's just inherent and natural to qualitative research, unfortunately. So for this, planning is really crucial because there's going to be time requirements, travel requirements, scheduling requirements that are not commonly as much of a barrier in other methodologies. It's also very important to clearly communicate to the participant beforehand what is going to be expected and how the session is going to go. So most people are more familiar with something like semi-structured interviews where you're asking questions and they're simply answering. This is very different in the way that you're going to be asking them to do a task, and they're going to go ahead and lead you through the process rather than you asking every single thing. Okay, next, let's do this. Next, go there. You're not leading them at all. They're doing this very naturally. And that can cause some uncomfortability with some people, and they may not want to actually participate in the research that way. So make sure that you level set with them ahead of time and they know exactly what they're getting into. For semi-structured interviews, this is probably the most common qualitative method for researchers. It's really our bread and butter method. It's also really core to a lot of other methodologies that utilize and expand on their use, such as contextual inquiry. You saw part of that was observation, but also you're going to be asking them in-depth questions. So it is also technically an interview as well. So in semi-structured interviews, you will have a small set of guiding questions for the entire interview. And this allows you to keep the conversation going and also keep the participant on topic while allowing for some flexibility to go deeper on particular topics or anything interesting that they happen to mention. This method also provides a lot of rich qualitative data because you're able to ask an initial question, receive an answer, and ask a follow-up question for clarity or context. And so that's what I mean by a QAQ format, by the way, if you're confused about that. Semi-structured interviews are typically between 30 to 60 minutes in length, and the intimate nature of them being one-on-one, two-way conversations allows time for the participant to get comfortable with you and typically begin to open up. And this can be really helpful in regard to sensitive issues such as low-income struggles, mental health topics, and accessibility frustrations. When you have like things like surveys or things like very quick discussions with these people, they're typically very guarded up front. And until they actually talk with you, get to know you, and you get to know them, they aren't likely to open up fully about these sensitive issues. Some disadvantages of it is that, again, time consuming. Although this is probably a little bit less than the contextual inquiry side, it's still going to take time finding the right participants, engaging them and letting them schedule with you, and then going and talking with them. And of course, then you're looking at 30 to 60 minutes straight of talking with them as well. So it is very time consuming. Teams will have to plan and align on specific topics and questions also to create the script used in the interview. And because it's a small set, you really have to narrow down what is going to be the key topics that are going to get to most of what we need to determine what we want to build ultimately. Or what do we need to know about the user at a core to really understand them as it relates to our topic area. Because the researcher is guiding this session, it is also easy to introduce bias through facial expressions, intonations, and the way that the questions are asked. And this is really especially hard when it's a follow-up question that you thought up on the fly. If something comes up, oftentimes you'll blurt something out with good intentions, but oftentimes it comes out with some level of bias inherently in it because you're curious about a specific thing and didn't have time to actually think through the question to make sure that it doesn't have any bias or leading parts of it. This also goes back to it being time consuming. So it's common for multiple people to check the interview script for potential bias before running a session. As interviews consist mostly of discussion, a lot of the participants' answers will have to rely on recall. And this can provide inaccurate data because they may recall incorrectly, especially if it's something that you're asking them to recall from a long time ago, or they may also play down their reaction in hindsight. For example, I may be extremely angry when I'm booking my ticket, but in hindsight, a year later, I may say, yeah, it was a little frustrating. I got a little mad at it. That doesn't fully and accurately capture my actual emotional reaction to that process. And that's something that in context research actually helps cover. For diary studies, they're an interesting, unique method of gathering qualitative and sometimes even quantitative data. This methodology is actually largely asynchronous. And so the participant is basically tasked with completing some activity within a time span of days, weeks, or even months. And every time the participant engages in anything related to the task, they are then instructed to open up their diary and record thoughts about their experience. Typically, there's some specific questions in there included by the researcher to help guide the participant to answers. So you may say, what activity were you trying to do? Where did you go to find it? What was your experience in the activity? Did you have any frustrations there, to guide them into kind of how to structure that journal entry? So because diary studies take place over a period of time, this allows for more problems and concerns to emerge that may not have been immediately noticeable to the participant at the first time. So it could be even just something that's maybe a minor annoyance at first, but as you encounter it again and again and again, at the end of day 3, it may be a much more major annoyance. And so you can also see how experience may change from one engagement to the next, and also be able to cover a large range of functionality because they have many days to complete the task. Since the participant logs data after every engagement, their experience is also likely to be fresh and less likely to be lost to recall, which was a problem in the interviews. They're also more likely to know external factors. So for example, I started my project, but then my parents interrupted me. And when I got back to it, I lost where I was, couldn't figure it out, had to create a new one. That's something that you normally would not be able to capture through other methods. You're also able to collect a wide variety of data types through diary studies. So you can have participants do rating questions, open-ended text submissions, record a video of their experience, send screenshots, all kinds of things. We previously had people send us have people send us videos showing us our product that they made and personalized. And they took us through every page and how they made every page. So it's very flexible in that way. On the disadvantages, you won't be able to directly observe participants, unlike some of the methods like contextual inquiry. And so that, of course, could lead to some missing data that the participant didn't think was important to include or note. On that note, self-reported data is also not particularly reliable. So there may be gaps in what the participant chooses to include, which could create bias. And also sometimes people just don't really know what they want or what they're doing. That happens much more frequently than you would think. And also diary studies are also just hard to recruit for. They are long obligations for participants. You'll want to make sure that the participants are engaging actively with the diary. There is a lot of drop off involved in this. And so you'll definitely have to recruit over what you think you're going to need. So if I need 5 people, typically we look at recruiting for 8, knowing that some of them are going to do some of the tasks and decide that they don't want to continue and drop off. And finally, on journey mapping. So this is commonly done in the discovery phase to empathize with the participant's end-to-end journey. And journey mapping typically involves observational interviews where the researcher follows along with the participant trying to reach an end goal. So for example, an end goal could be finding a mental health resource that I'm interested in and that's nearby and accessible to me. So along the way, the researcher will pay close attention to the activities the participant does, their thoughts as they go through every step, and their emotional state at every point. And so the end product is basically a map that shows clear dips in experience and emotional states that are associated with steps, activities, and thoughts. So you can see where are kind of opportunity areas for you to improve an experience. Journey mapping is largely in context as you are watching the participant go through the process in real time. However, it does not always take into account the environment, unlike contextual inquiry. So they could really be doing this more or less anywhere and not necessarily in their natural environment, and they're not leading the entire activity. It also provides a great visual to align on for the team with clear points of opportunity where there's a dip in emotional state. It's also great for triangulating the concurrent thoughts, activities, and emotional states at every step through the process. Journey mapping is unfortunately very time consuming because you have to spend lengths of time with multiple participants to get a good idea of what their general journey looks like. It is also then kind of a fixed map, where in reality, the processes that a participant goes through are often fluid. So for example, my process may change between this morning and later today even. I may more have time in the morning, and so I may be able to go through things in more detail, but at night I may be zooming through screens just trying to get to a checkout process. Journey mapping also isn't standalone. Journey mapping is also standalone and doesn't really consider the interrelationships between different journeys that may exist, correlating a little bit also with the lack of flexibility. Let me skip ahead. So our last part is really looking at best practices for creating your questions. We won't get into actual question creation, but these are things that I want you to consider and check as you go through your creation of questions to make sure that they are sound questions and they're relevant. So as noted at the beginning of this workshop, the discovery phase is really purposefully ambiguous. We want to make sure that we stay as broad as possible. So I want you to consider if each question could be asked in a broader way. So for example, I could ask a whole series of questions. I could ask, do you work in an office? Is your work mostly desk-based or is it paper-based? I could also ask, do you attend meetings during the workday? Or I could simply ask, can you tell me a little bit about your typical day at work? And that actually would answer more or less all of those questions. And if not, I can always follow up on specific details. So consider how you can make these topics a little bit more broad and less specific to encompass everything that the participant thinks is relevant and important to include. A major struggle point, especially for new researchers, is minimizing bias in their question sets. So include multiple reviewers and carefully go over every question to consider if the question could be introducing bias. So for example, I might have a question like, how do you like the current Steam storefront? I could rephrase that to be less biased, where I can ask, how do you feel about the current Steam storefront? So I don't imply that they do like the current Steam storefront. Also consider if the question is leading, which is basically if it implies a particular desired answer. So rather than, how well would this save time looking for the game you want? You could rephrase that to, how might this affect how efficiently you are able to find the game you want? And so we're taking out particular words and phrasing rather than saying you are saving time. We're not assuming that. We're saying, how does this affect it? A good question format also to include is the critical incident method. And so this involves asking the participant to tell you about an activity. And this can be the last time they did an activity, the time that they had the most fun doing an activity, or the time they were so frustrated that they ended up quitting doing the activity. And so you want to make sure that this is relevant to what you're looking at. So for example, if I'm looking at an activity that may be something like finding mental health resources, we want to make sure that it's something that is not frustrating. So I may ask, tell me about the last time that you tried to look for mental health resources and it wasn't the best experience for you. Tell me about a time that it may have been frustrating for you. Tell me about a time that you weren't able to find an accurate or a good quality mental health resource. And this opens up the floor to opportunity areas that you can further dive into and ask more specifics around. Also check for relevancy. So make sure you don't include fluff questions that aren't actually related to your key research topics. That's why we spend so much time defining what you know, what you might know, and what you don't know. Make sure that all of these research questions relate back to some of those key research topics. If my goal is to understand users' mindsets, I likely won't care exactly what tool set they're using, and I would get much better information asking questions around how they choose their solutions. So make sure that the focus is there and it goes back to one of your key topics. Another thing to consider is how you arrange your questions. So make sure that there's a logical format to your question list. Typically, I will group up my questions by subject area. So I may focus in the beginning about the participants' past experiences. Then I'll ask about their typical day or process and move into specific behaviors. We want to really avoid ping-ponging between topics, so it's easy for the participant to think through and follow along. Or if you do have to ping-pong between topics, at least ensure there's some kind of logical flow. So something like a chronological flow. I may ask about different topics, but it all may be within past versus present versus future. Also make sure that you account for the possible follow-up questions and deeper probes, especially if it relates to a key area you're lacking knowledge in. This helps to avoid having to create questions on the fly, which can, again, easily introduce bias in leading questions. As we cross-checked our questions for relevancy, also remember to cross-check your topics. So make sure that you have a good amount of questions for each research topic and you don't accidentally skip over any. And finally, it's always a good idea to run a pilot. So this includes still using a real participant, but acknowledging that issues probably will come up and the research guide may not be followed as expected. And so you can use this initial pilot session to learn. So for example, we could learn ways to avoid miscommunication with the participant when setting expectations for the session, which is very important to contextual inquiry. Or we can learn how to better phrase some of our questions that were a little bit too ambiguous. They didn't quite understand what we're asking for, so we had to, unfortunately, include examples. Or we can add key follow-up questions that arose. We can even go as far as adding in entire research topics that we uncovered during the pilot that seemed promising and we want to dive deeper into. We are not on time, but I almost made it. And so the next steps really are to take all of what we did here and all of your notes and compare and align as a team. Make sure that you're gathering everyone's notes together, seeing where things overlap and where things differ, and decide what is important to focus on and what is most important to learn in this space, given that you only have a week. After that, work on brainstorming research topics and questions, and then form a very concise strategy on how to go forward using the different methodologies that I helped present.
Hey everyone, on behalf of IterateUX, we would like to thank you so much for watching this week's event. If you like the content, please leave a like and subscribe. We'll have events every Thursday at 5:30 Pacific Time. Join our Discord in the description to find out more.